peaceful stone walls of a medieval convent, often depicted as havens of calm devotion, hid a darker truth, what truly lurked beyond the cloister's gates. What terrors, from the 11th to the 15th centuries, threatened to shatter their serene existence. Number 6. The scourge of open warfare. The world outside the convent walls was rarely static. Kings rose and fell, lords vied for power, and borders shifted with the bloody tide of conflict. For communities of nuns, isolated by choice and often surrounded by vast fertile lands that made tempting targets, warfare was not a distant rumor, but a very real and present danger. Imagine the rhythmic thud of marching boots, not of pilgrims, but of an army, growing louder day by day. These were not simply passing soldiers. They were often hungry, desperate, and notoriously undisciplined. A convent, with its stores of food, its valuable liturgical items, and sometimes even a modest treasury, represented a prize. The devastation could be swift and brutal. In the year 1215, during the tumultuous reign of King John of England, a contingent of French mercenary soldiers, fresh from pillaging the estates of rebellious barons, descended upon the Benedictine convent of St. Agatha in Wiltshire. Convent, modest in size, but possessing good land and a well-stocked granary, was deemed an easy target. The sisters, under the leadership of Abbess Eleanor, had heard rumors of the approaching force, but had little means to defend themselves beyond locked gates and the prayers of their community. When the soldiers breached the outer wall, not through an organized siege, but a casual act of vandalism and brute force, the sisters were forced to retreat to the chapel, hoping the sanctity of the place would offer some protection. It did not. The mercenaries ransacked the refectory, emptied the cellars, and shattered the stained glass windows of the church, taking candlesticks and reliquaries. While no physical harm came to the nuns themselves, a common mercy extended in some, but certainly not all, instances. The psychological toll was immense. The convent archives, later compiled by Sister Benedicta, record the deep trauma and the profound sense of vulnerability that lingered for years. Repairing the damage to the buildings and restocking the provisions consumed the convent's meager savings and forced them to rely heavily on the charity of sympathetic local gentry, a humiliating ordeal for an institution that prided itself on its self-sufficiency. Sometimes, a convent found itself caught in a full-blown siege, not as a primary target, but as collateral damage in a wider conflict. During the 100 Years' War, the Cistercian convent of Notre Dame des Champs in Normandy became an unwilling fortress. Perched on a slight rise, its stone walls, though not designed for military defense, offered some natural protection. In 1346, as English forces under King Edward III advanced towards Calais, a detachment decided to encamp around the convent, using its proximity as a base of operations. The nuns found their peaceful cloisters transformed into a military camp. Soldiers demanded food and lodging, trampling the convent gardens and turning the chapter house into a command post. Abbess Isabella bravely negotiated with the English commander Sir Thomas Hastings, seeking to protect her sisters and the sanctity of their enclosed life. For weeks, the convent endured the constant noise, the fear of violence, and the drain on their resources. The sisters, accustomed to the quiet rhythms of prayer and labor, now witnessed acts of brutality outside their gates, heard the cries of wounded soldiers, and had to contend with the boisterous, often impious behavior of the troops. The convent's chronicles from this period, known as the Annals of Despair, vividly describe the disruption to their spiritual life and the constant fear. When the English forces finally moved on, the convent was left impoverished, their lands devastated by foraging soldiers, and their buildings scarred by neglect and misuse. The sisters faced a long and arduous process of recovery, relying on loans from the local bishop and a special papal indulgence to raise funds for their restoration. Even if a convent was not directly attacked, the presence of war nearby could be ruinous. Armies on the march would inevitably forage for supplies, stripping the surrounding countryside of food and livestock. This left local populations destitute, meaning that traditional sources of tithes and donations to the convent dried up. The destruction of roads and bridges made travel dangerous and difficult, disrupting trade and preventing the convent from selling its produce or receiving essential goods. The Augustinian convent of St. Catherine, located near a major trade route in Bavaria, experienced this during the Hussite Wars in the early 15th century. Though untouched by the direct fighting, the constant movement of armies, both Hussite and imperial, transformed the region into a dangerous wasteland. Convent tenants, already struggling, could no longer pay their rents, and the markets, where the nuns sold their surplus wool and cheese, ceased to function. Sister Agnes, the cellarer, meticulously recorded the dwindling supplies in her account books, showing how the convent was forced to ration food and forego necessary repairs to their buildings. The war-torn landscape also meant fewer pilgrims, who often brought generous offerings, further depleting the convent's income. The spiritual solace of the convent was also impacted. The constant threat and the pervasive atmosphere of violence in the outside world could not help but penetrate the cloister, causing anxiety and disrupting the contemplative peace. Nuns who had once felt secure in their calling now lived with a gnawing uncertainty, their very existence dependent on the fluctuating fortunes of distant battles. The long-term effects of such conflicts were profound, often leaving convents impoverished, struggling to rebuild their communities and facing years of hardship before any semblance of normalcy could return. Number 5. The shadow of lawlessness and banditry. Beyond the organized chaos of war, there lay a more pervasive and insidious threat: the everyday lawlessness that often plagued the medieval countryside. The writ of kings and lords often ran thin in remote areas, creating fertile ground for bandits, desperate vagrants, and renegade knights. For convents, often situated in rural seclusion, their vulnerability was magnified by their perceived wealth and the limited means of their own defense. These weren't always grand coordinated attacks. Sometimes it was small bands of desperate men driven by hunger or greed who saw the convent as an easy target. The Benedictine convent of St. Mary of the Woods in Saxony, established in the 11th century, was particularly susceptible due to its isolated location deep within a dense forest. Convent had no formidable stone walls, only a stout wooden palisade deemed sufficient in more peaceful times. In 1087, a series of poor harvests had left the local peasantry on the brink of starvation. A group of former serfs, turned brigands out of sheer desperation, descended upon the convent one autumn night. They were not seeking to harm the sisters, but rather to plunder the convent's granary and steal the few pigs and chickens that ranged freely in the courtyard. Abbess Hildegard, a woman of formidable spirit, managed to rouse the convent servants, and remarkably even some of the older nuns, to create a loud clamor, banging pots and pans, and ringing the chapel bells. This cacophony, combined with the braying of the convent donkey, led the bandits to believe a larger force was arriving. They fled, taking only a few sacks of flour and a terrified hen. While the immediate damage was limited, the incident instilled a deep-seated fear in the community. Convent records, meticulously kept by Sister Theodora, describe the subsequent efforts to fortify their defenses, including digging a deeper ditch around their palisade and petitioning the local count for a permanent guard, a request that was often met with indifference or a demand for hefty payment. Rogue knights, disinherited or simply seeking plunder, posed an even graver threat. Unlike common bandits, these individuals often possessed military training, armor, and a small retinue of armed followers. They operated with a sense of entitlement, often viewing monastic property as fair game. In 1281, Sir Gareth of Greywater, a disgraced knight with a reputation for brutality, terrorized the lands around the Cistercian convent of the Holy Cross in Shropshire. He had lost his estates in a legal dispute and resorted to banditry to sustain himself and his men. Convent, known for its fine wool production and lucrative sheep flocks, became his primary target. Sir Gareth did not merely raid, he extorted. He would send messages to Abbess Joanna demanding protection money in exchange for not plundering their lands and seizing their livestock. Refusal meant swift and brutal consequences. On one occasion, when the convent was slow to meet his demands, his men burned a section of the convent's prime pasture land, destroying vital fodder for their sheep. The sisters lived in constant fear, unable to farm their fields or tend their flocks without risking encounters with the knight's men. Abbess Joanna sought aid from the Bishop of Hereford and the Earl of Arundel, but their responses were slow and largely ineffective. The distance and the knight's elusive tactics made intervention difficult. Convent was forced to pay the tribute for over a year, depleting their reserves and forcing them to sell off some of their valuable liturgical vestments to meet the demands. Chronicle of the convent during this period, known as the Lamentations of Holy Cross, recounts the moral dilemma faced by the abbess, paying the criminal or risking the destruction of her community. This kind of systemic extortion, often by powerful but lawless individuals, was a constant drain on monastic resources and a source of profound insecurity. Travel, even for essential business, became fraught with danger. Nuns might need to travel to attend monastic chapters, visit dependent priories, or appear before bishops and papal legates. These journeys were long and arduous, often traversing isolated roads. A small entourage of nuns, perhaps, accompanied by a lay brother or a few servants, presented an appealing target for highwaymen. In 1370, a small delegation from the Poor Clares convent of Santa Maria della Pace in Tuscany was ambushed while returning from Florence, where they had gone to purchase supplies and sell embroidered cloths. Two sisters, accompanied by Brother Anselmo, the convent's elderly steward, were set upon by three masked men near a remote pass. The bandits did not seek to harm the sisters, but they relieved them of the coin purse containing the proceeds from their sales, as well as the valuable bolts of silk they had purchased. Brother Anselmo was badly beaten when he tried to resist. The sisters returned to the convent, traumatized and empty-handed. The loss of the funds was a severe blow, forcing the convent to postpone necessary repairs to their infirmary for nearly a year. The incident recorded in the convent's necrology also meant that subsequent travel was undertaken with greater fear and more extensive and expensive precautions, often requiring hired guards or seeking the escort of local lords' men-at-arms. Such incidents underscore how the pervasive threat of lawlessness impacted even the most basic aspects of conventual life, transforming routine necessities into hazardous expeditions. The lack of effective centralized law enforcement meant that many convents existed in a state of perpetual vigilance, their peace always threatened by the shadow of disorder beyond their gates. Number 4. The unseen foe of disease and pestilence. The medieval world was one perpetually on the brink of epidemic. While the Black Death of the mid-14th century remains the most infamous example, countless other diseases from influenza to dysentery to smallpox constantly menaced communities. For convents, often tightly knit and sharing close quarters, an outbreak could be particularly devastating, striking down sisters and servants alike and severely disrupting the rhythm of their enclosed lives. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe in 1347 brought an unprecedented level of terror and death. Its shadow fell equally upon peasant hovels and baronial castles, and monastic houses were certainly not spared. The Benedictine convent of St. Hildegard in Cologne, a prosperous and well-regarded institution, felt the full force of the pestilence in the summer of 1349. Though the convent had closed its gates to all but essential visitors, the plague found its way in, likely carried by supplies or by a lay servant who had contact with the outside world. The first sister to fall ill, Sister Martha, was dead within days. Her death was followed by others with terrifying rapidity. The infirmary usually a quiet place for elderly or ailing sisters, quickly became overwhelmed. Convents chronicles, pieced together from surviving fragments by later sisters, reveal a harrowing account. Nuns who had dedicated their lives to spiritual contemplation were now faced with the grim task of caring for their dying sisters. Often without the necessary medical knowledge or even enough healthy hands to assist, lay sisters who performed the physical labor of the convent were among the first to succumb, leaving the remaining choir nuns to manage the cooking, cleaning, and farming. The impact was catastrophic. Within a few months, more than half of the convent's population, including the Abbess Gertrudis and several key obediengeries, like the cellarer and the sacristan, had perished. The loss of so many experienced and dedicated sisters created a profound crisis. Not only was the convent grieving, but its very administration and spiritual leadership were crippled. The regular cycle of prayer, the Opus Dei, which formed the bedrock of convent life, was impossible to maintain in its entirety. Choirs became sparse, and services were abbreviated or even suspended due to the lack of sisters healthy enough to attend or lead them. Convents' financial affairs also suffered immensely. The cellarer who managed the convent's lands and income was gone, and the records show that the convent's tenants, themselves decimated by the plague, could not pay their rents. The external world, too, was in disarray, meaning that new novices who would typically replenish the community were scarce. The surviving Sisters of St. Hildegard faced years of struggle to rebuild their community, to find new vocations, and to restore the convent to its former spiritual and economic health. The collective memory of the plague, passed down through generations of nuns, became a stark reminder of their vulnerability to forces beyond their control. Beyond the major pandemics, smaller, more localized outbreaks of disease were a constant concern. A bad harvest could lead to famine, which in turn weakened resistance to common ailments like influenza or dysentery. Premonstratensian convent of St. Michael in Flanders, situated near a river, was particularly prone to outbreaks of flux, a medieval term for dysentery, often caused by contaminated water sources. In 1310, a severe winter was followed by a wet spring leading to widespread flooding and a subsequent epidemic in the surrounding villages. Despite precautions, the illness soon spread to the convent. Sister Ursula, the infirmarian, a woman renowned for her practical skills but limited medical knowledge, did her best with herbal remedies and desperate prayers. The disease, though less lethal than the plague, caused widespread, debilitating illness. Many sisters were confined to their beds, unable to perform their duties. The daily life of the convent ground to a halt. The fields were left untended, the baking of bread was delayed, and the making of cheese ceased. The financial implications were significant. The convent had to pay for external help, often at exorbitant rates, to manage the farm and maintain essential services. The illness lingered for weeks, leaving many sisters weakened and slow to recover. The incident mentioned in the convent's visitors' reports highlighted the constant fragility of a community that relied on the healthy functioning of all its members. Perception of the convent from the outside world during such times also varied. Some convents were seen as places of refuge, where the sick might be brought for care, taxing the limited resources and exposing the nuns to further contagion. Others, however, might be viewed with suspicion, particularly if the deaths within were numerous and sudden. The isolated Cistercian convent of Our Lady of the Mount in Aragon, while largely spared the worst of the Black Death due to its remote location, faced a different challenge during a local outbreak of smallpox in 1420. Convent operated a small guest house for pilgrims, and when a few pilgrims fell ill, the convent quickly became a perceived source of infection by the fearful local populace. Villagers, in their desperation and ignorance, began to avoid the convent entirely, fearing it was a breeding ground for the disease. Pilgrimages ceased, and donations, a vital source of income, dried up. Convent found itself ostracized, its good name momentarily tarnished by association with the pestilence. Convent's annalist, Sister Helena, noted with sorrow how the fear and prejudice of the outside world, born of desperation and lack of understanding, could be as damaging as the illness itself, disrupting their mission and isolating them further from the very people they sought to serve spiritually. The constant threat of disease, whether a mass pandemic or a localized affliction, underscored the precariousness of medieval life and the profound challenges it posed to the stability and daily operations of female monastic communities. Number 3. The relentless pressure of economic hardship and exploitation. Life for medieval convents, despite popular portrayals of opulent ease, was often a precarious dance with financial solvency. They were largely agrarian institutions, relying on the productivity of their land, the generosity of patrons, and the careful management of their resources. However, external economic pressures, often compounded by the greed of secular lords or the vagaries of nature, presented a constant gnawing threat to their existence. One of the most fundamental economic challenges was the vulnerability to poor harvests and famine. The medieval agricultural system was highly dependent on weather patterns. A prolonged drought or excessive rain could decimate crops, leading to food shortages not only for the local population, but also for the convent itself. The Cistercian convent of St. Faith in Yorkshire, founded in the 12th century, possessed extensive arable land, and its income largely depended on its grain output. In 1258, a particularly harsh winter followed by a miserably cold and wet spring led to a disastrous harvest across much of England. Convents' fields, usually teeming with wheat and barley, yielded barely a third of their usual output. Abbess Matilda, in her surviving letters to the local bishop, described the grim reality. The convent granaries were almost empty, and the sisters faced starvation. Convent had to purchase grain from distant regions at inflated prices, an expense that quickly depleted their modest treasury. Their tenants, who also faced ruin, could not pay their customary rents in kind or in coin. This meant a double blow: less food produced directly, and less income to buy food elsewhere. Convent was forced to sell off some of its livestock, including valuable sheep that were crucial for their wool production, a secondary source of income. This short-term solution created a long-term problem, crippling their ability to recover in subsequent years. The records from St. Faith show that it took nearly a decade for the convent to fully recover its financial stability after this single devastating harvest, illustrating how a natural calamity could push even a well-established institution to the brink of ruin. Beyond natural disasters, convents frequently faced direct exploitation from powerful secular lords. These lords, who often held patronage rights over the convent, could exert immense pressure for financial gain. They might demand excessive feudal dues, request loans that were rarely repaid, or even seize convent lands under dubious pretexts. The Benedictine convent of Santa Clara in Castile, thriving in the early 14th century due to its extensive vineyards, attracted the covetous eye of Don Rodrigo de Guzman, a powerful but notoriously avaricious nobleman. Don Rodrigo, claiming ancient feudal rights, began to demand an ever-increasing share of the convent's wine production. He also insisted that the convent provide lodging and provisions for his retinue whenever he passed through the area, which was with increasing frequency transforming these visits into ruinous impositions. Abbess Elena, a shrewd but ultimately outmatched negotiator, protested vehemently, citing papal bulls and royal charters that guaranteed the convent's autonomy and fiscal independence. However, Don Rodrigo had significant local power and connections at court. He simply ignored her pleas, even going so far as to block the roads leading to the convent's markets, preventing the sale of their wine and thus crippling their income. The convent found itself in a desperate position. unable to resist without risking outright violence and land seizure. They were forced to comply with Don Rodrigo's demands, which severely reduced their income and prevented them from maintaining their buildings or supporting their charitable works. Chronicle of Santa Clara, written by a later sister, sadly recounts how the convent's prosperity declined significantly under this relentless pressure, its once famous vineyards struggling due to lack of investment and the constant drain on their resources, a stark example of how powerful individuals could simply prey on vulnerable monastic communities. Taxation, though sometimes legitimate, could also become an unbearable burden. While convents were often exempt from certain taxes, this depended on specific royal or papal grants, which could be revoked or ignored. Kings, perpetually short of funds for wars or lavish courts, often looked to monastic institutions as a source of ready wealth. In England, during the reign of Edward I, convents, along with other ecclesiastical institutions, faced heavy taxation to fund his wars against Scotland and France. The Augustinian convent of St. Scholastica in Kent, already struggling with debt from an earlier fire, found itself liable for significant royal levies. Abbess Margaret appealed directly to the king, highlighting the convent's poverty and its inability to pay without selling off essential assets. Her pleas were largely ignored. The convent was forced to borrow money from Jewish moneylenders at high interest rates, a practice often condemned by the church but necessary for survival. This spiraled into a deeper cycle of debt. Convents' account books from this period show meticulously recorded expenditures for interest payments, diverting funds that should have gone to food, clothing for the sisters, or alms for the poor. The convent was forced to curtail its hospitality, a traditional monastic duty, and even to reduce the number of lay sisters, as they could no longer afford to feed and house them. This period of intense financial strain left St. Scholastica depleted, its buildings crumbling and its community disheartened, demonstrating how even legitimate demands from secular authorities, if excessive, could threaten the very existence of a convent. Land disputes were another common source of economic drain and anxiety. Property boundaries were often ill-defined, and powerful neighbors might encroach on convent lands, claim rights of pasturage, or divert water sources. Litigation in medieval courts was incredibly slow and expensive, often bleeding the convent dry even if they ultimately won the case. The Benedictine convent of Fermoutiers in Francia, an ancient foundation with extensive forest lands, found itself embroiled in a protracted dispute with a neighboring baron over timber rights in the 13th century. The baron, claiming a historical easement, began felling trees on convent property. Abbess Agnes took the case to the local seigneurial court, initiating a legal battle that lasted for nearly 5 years. The convent had to employ legal counsel, travel to court numerous times, and present extensive documentation. The legal fees alone were crippling. Even though the convent eventually prevailed and the baron was forced to cease his timber operations, the cost of the victory was immense. The funds spent on litigation could have been used for essential repairs to the convent's aging church roof, or for founding a new school for local girls. Cartularia of Fermoutiers contains numerous entries detailing the expenditures on this dispute, a testament to the fact that even defending their legitimate rights could be a severe economic burden. These constant economic pressures, whether from natural disasters, predatory lords, or the demands of the state, meant that a convent's financial well-being was always a fragile thing, requiring constant vigilance and often extraordinary resilience. Number 2. The tightening grip of ecclesiastical interference and control. While convents were ostensibly dedicated to God, they were also deeply embedded within the hierarchical structure of the medieval church. This meant they were subject to the authority of bishops, abbots of male orders, especially for daughter houses, and sometimes even the Pope himself. While often intended to ensure orthodoxy and proper discipline, this external ecclesiastical control frequently devolved into petty interference demands for resources or even outright attempts to suppress a convent's autonomy, posing a distinct and significant threat to their independence and well-being. Bishops, as the spiritual heads of their dioceses, held considerable power over convents. They conducted visitations, approved elections of abbesses, and could issue decrees concerning the internal life of the community. While some bishops were supportive patrons, others saw convents as sources of revenue or as institutions to be brought firmly under their own particular vision of monasticism. The Cistercian convent of St. Mary of the Valley in Burgundy, a fairly wealthy foundation, experienced this firsthand in the early 13th century under Bishop Adalbert of Dijon. Bishop Adalbert, known for his rigorous enforcement of clerical discipline, began to demand extensive annual contributions from the convent for the upkeep of his episcopal palace and for diocesan charitable projects. He argued that the convent, being well endowed, had a duty to contribute more to the wider church. Abbess Christine, a prudent administrator, understood the convent's obligations, but found the demands increasingly excessive, threatening their ability to maintain their own community and support their dependent poor. When she subtly resisted, Adalbert used his authority during a canonical visitation to criticize the convent's observance, finding fault with minor irregularities in their diet and dress. He threatened to impose stricter rules, and even to remove the abbess if his financial demands were not met. The convent was forced to concede, paying large sums that severely depleted their treasury. The Liber Visitationum Episcopi Adalberti, a collection of the bishop's official visitation records, details his harsh pronouncements and the substantial sums levied, demonstrating how ecclesiastical authority, when wielded by an avaricious or overly zealous bishop, could become a significant burden on a convent's finances. Furthermore, convents were often subject to the authority of male monastic orders. Benedictine convents were often overseen by the abbots of nearby Benedictine monasteries, and Cistercian convents by their respective male Cistercian fathers. This paternalistic oversight, while providing spiritual guidance, could also become a source of contention. These male superiors might interfere in the election of an abbess, preferring a candidate more pliable to their will, or they might dictate the convent's internal rules without fully understanding the unique needs of a female community. The Benedictine convent of St. Anne in Bavaria, a daughter house of the great monastery of St. Gall, faced such interference in the late 12th century. When Abbess Gerber died, the community of St. Anne elected Sister Gisela, a widely respected and learned nun, to succeed her. However, Abbot Reginold of St. Gall, who held the right to confirm the election, refused to approve Gisela. He argued that she was too intellectual and not sufficiently meek for the role, and instead put forward his own candidate, a younger, less experienced nun from another Benedictine house who was known to be closely related to a powerful local family, possibly for political reasons. The Sisters of St. Anne were deeply offended and resisted the imposition, leading to a bitter dispute that lasted for months. The convent's daily life was thrown into turmoil, its spiritual peace shattered by the power struggle. Eventually, under immense pressure from Abbot Reginold and the local bishop, the sisters were forced to yield, accepting the abbot's preferred candidate. This incident, recorded in the Annals Sancti Anna, highlights how male monastic superiors could override the collective will and autonomy of a female community, asserting their authority in ways that were detrimental to the convent's internal harmony and self-governance. Even the Pope, the ultimate authority in the Church, could exert control that caused significant challenges. Papal legates dispatched to enforce reforms or to investigate complaints could impose new rules or demand financial contribution directly. Poor clerics, dedicated to a life of strict poverty, faced repeated attempts by the papacy to impose uniform rules that did not always suit the varying needs and contexts of their scattered convents. In the 14th century, a papal bull was issued attempting to enforce stricter enclosure on all Poor Clare convents, regardless of their local circumstances, or their traditional involvement in almsgiving and limited interaction with the local community. The Poor Clare convent of San Damiano in Umbria, known for its outreach to the sick and poor, found this new decree particularly burdensome. Abbess Caterina argued that their rule allowed for limited external contact for charitable purposes, and that enforcing absolute enclosure would cripple their ability to fulfill their mission of mercy. The papal legate, however, was unyielding, threatening excommunication for non-compliance. Convent was forced to comply, limiting their sisters' movement and drastically reducing their charitable work. This imposed change, while perhaps aimed at promoting spiritual purity, caused deep resentment within the community and estranged them from the local populace they had served for decades. Convents' correspondence with their local bishop, archive in Perugia, reveals their anguish and the difficulties they faced in adapting to the new strictures, illustrating how even well-intentioned ecclesiastical reforms could be imposed in ways that caused significant harm to a convent's identity and its relationship with its surrounding community. This constant external oversight and the potential for top-down interference meant that convents were often not masters of their own destiny, their very existence and practices subject to the whims and directives of powerful male figures. Number 1. The lingering stain of social prejudice and public perception. Perhaps the most insidious and difficult threat for medieval convents to combat was the shifting tide of social prejudice and the often unfavorable public perception. While initially viewed with reverence and as havens of spiritual devotion, as the centuries passed, convents often found themselves scrutinized, misunderstood, and sometimes even actively maligned by the very society they served. Accusations of moral laxity, witchcraft, or simply being unproductive burdens on the community could erode their standing and expose them to various forms of hostility. The charge of moral laxity was a recurring theme. Despite the rigorous vows taken by nuns, rumors and gossip about their behavior were commonplace. Sometimes these were fueled by anti-clerical sentiment, other times by disgruntled former servants, or simply by the general human tendency towards suspicion of those who lived apart from conventional society. The Benedictine convent of St. Genevieve in Picardy in the late 14th century faced a particularly damaging wave of such rumors. Stories circulated in the nearby town that the nuns were not observing their enclosure, that they entertained male visitors, and that their fasting was less rigorous than it should be. These were often exaggerated or entirely fabricated tales, possibly spread by local merchants who resented the convent's economic privileges or by landowners eyeing their fertile fields. Abbess Marguerite, a woman of strong reputation, tried to counter these rumors by inviting local notables to witness the convent's rigorous observance during a special service, but the whispers persisted. Consequence was a significant decline in donations and a reluctance among respectable families to send their daughters to the convent as novices. The community found itself increasingly isolated. The convent's own internal documents from this period, particularly the chapter minutes, revealed a deep concern among the sisters about their tarnished reputation and the difficulty of fighting against unseen enemies. This erosion of public trust meant not only financial hardship but also a profound spiritual isolation, as the community felt their very legitimacy being questioned by the outside world. More chillingly, as fear of witchcraft and heresy gripped parts of Europe, some convents found themselves caught in the terrifying crosshairs of such accusations. Though nuns were generally considered pious, the very fact of their reclusive life and their engagement in spiritual practices, which might be misunderstood, could sometimes make them targets. In the early 15th century, during a period of intense witch hunts in parts of Germany, the Cistercian convent of Marienau in Westphalia, known for its reclusive practices and the sisters' devotion to herbal medicine, found itself under suspicion. A local peasant, whose child had died after being treated with a convent herbal remedy, accused the sisters of witchcraft. This was amplified by an overzealous inquisitor who, arriving in the region, saw the convent's relative autonomy and distinct spiritual practices as a potential breeding ground for heterodoxy. While no nun was ever formally convicted or executed, the convent endured a period of intense scrutiny and investigation. The sisters were subjected to interrogations by ecclesiastical authorities, their books and practices examined for signs of unorthodoxy. The fear within the community was palpable. Convents' spiritual life was severely disrupted, and their reputation among the local populace was irrevocably damaged. Even after the accusations were dismissed, the stigma remained, and for years few local families dared to send their daughters to Marianao, nor did many pilgrims seek its spiritual solace. Convents' chronicles of this period, though carefully worded, reveal the profound psychological toll and the lingering sense of injustice felt by the sisters, who had their faith and intentions so cruelly questioned. Finally, there was the more subtle but pervasive prejudice that viewed convents as unproductive or even a burden on society. As feudal structures evolved and proto-capitalist ideas began to emerge, some lay people, particularly those struggling financially, began to question the value of institutions that did not directly contribute to the economy in a tangible, quantifiable way. Convents, with their extensive landholdings and their focus on prayer and contemplation, could be seen by some as simply consuming resources without giving back. This was particularly true if a convent's tenants were struggling, or if the convent itself was perceived as wealthy while the surrounding populace suffered. In the late 15th century, the Augustinian convent of the Holy Spirit in Flanders, despite its long history of charity and hospitality, found itself increasingly criticized by the burgeoning merchant class of the nearby town. The merchants, driven by a new emphasis on commerce and industry, viewed the convent's large agricultural estates as inefficiently managed and its sisters as idle. Pamphlets, anonymously printed and circulated in the town, occasionally attacked the convent, questioning why such a large tract of land was not being used for more profitable enterprises or taxed more heavily. While these criticisms did not lead to direct violence, they fostered an atmosphere of resentment and suspicion. Donations from the merchant class, once a reliable source of income, dwindled to almost nothing. Convent found it increasingly difficult to recruit new novices from respectable urban families, as the conventual life was seen by some as an outdated and unproductive path. The convent's own correspondence from this period shows a desperate attempt to justify their existence, highlighting their charitable works and their prayers for the community, but struggling to overcome the growing utilitarian mindset of the age. This shift in public perception, from reverence to skepticism and even animosity, represented a fundamental challenge to the very social contract that had allowed convents to flourish for centuries, leaving them vulnerable to a slow but profound decline in influence.